Is there something wrong with President Trump's audacious plan to let the Gazans leave Gaza? Is that a human rights violation? Is that ethnic cleansing, as it's being called? Here's an interview between Ben Shapiro and Brooke Goldstein, who's a human rights attorney, so you can actually get the facts on this matter.
President Trump thinking outside the box and changing the world in doing so. Well, joining us on the line to discuss President Trump's audacious statements about what should happen next with Gaza is Brooke Goldstein, human rights attorney and president of the Lawfare Project, a pro bono organization representing victims of anti-Semitism. She's also an expert on the Middle East. Brooke, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Ben, I appreciate being here with you. Thank you for having me.
So when it comes to President Trump's announcement, I think it's difficult to overstate just what a massive ground shift this is in terms of Middle Eastern politics, in terms of the way people view the entire situation in the Middle East. I spoke about this on the show yesterday, but essentially every aspect of idiotic conventional wisdom that has been tried and failed for 75 odd years, President Trump overturned all of it. Maybe you can speak to some of the premises that President Trump just threw directly out the window in favor of actual reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, the whole premise that there is a two-state solution, right? That creating another Islamist state in a sea of failed Islamist dictatorship is some sort of solution to anything, especially when you don't get rid of the radicalization problem. And this notion that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has to be solved before any progress is made in the region was already debunked during Trump's first term with the historic Abraham Accords. And now people are crying violations of international law because Trump wants to save the civilian population in Gaza from being used as human shields. I want to say very clearly, Trump's suggestion to temporarily remove the civilians in Gaza for their own safety is 100% legal. The Geneva Convention prohibits the permanent relocation of a civilian population by an occupying power. Now, forget the fact that there is no occupying power there, that there's no sovereign that is currently in control and Hamas is illegitimate, right? There's an exception. The Geneva Convention says that if civilians need to be removed for their own safety, they can be. And that's clearly what's happening here. Hamas, which is operating in violation of the Geneva Convention, using civilians as human shields, recruiting thousands of children as child soldiers, is using the civilian population in order to maintain a terrorist state. They are hiding within hospitals, within schools. The only way to make Gaza safe, the only way to guarantee the safety of these civilians is to temporarily relocate them. And nobody is saying they can't go back. Everyone is free to go back, whether you're Jews, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Druze, whether you're Christian. Anyone who once lived in Gaza should be free to return to Gaza once it is made safe.
So, Brooke, there's so many sort of claims that are being made that are just legally specious here. So what you've heard is, well, this is Palestinian land. It's a violation of law because it's Palestinian land. There's literally no iteration of law by which this is Palestinian land. Prior to 1948, it was ruled by the British Mandate. Between 1948 and 1967, it was occupied by Egypt. At no point was there an independent Palestinian state there. In fact, the only autonomy ever granted to the Palestinians in this area was granted by Israel in 2005, when it pulled completely out of the Gaza Strip and allowed Hamas to be elected in the Gaza Strip by Palestinians living there. So this idea that there's any sort of legal claim by anyone to that land connected with the Palestinians, what legal grounds? I mean, you've heard this kind of trotted out there routinely by members of the mainstream media and the left. I've yet to hear an actual legal argument for why this is quote unquote Palestinian land as opposed to, say, Israeli land, Egyptian land, or anybody else's.
Right. Well, they defeat their own legal argument when they claim that every single so-called Palestinian Muslim living in Gaza is a refugee. So Gaza, therefore, is not their home. And if Gaza is their home, then the entire premise upon which the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict exists is false. I've said many times that the whole construct of the exclusive Palestinian Muslim identity is one that's bigoted, right? My ancestors, before the establishment of the modern state of Israel, were Palestinian, described themselves as Palestinian. The Jerusalem Post used to be called the Palestine Post. Palestine is a geographic location. It's not an exclusive Muslim ethnicity, religion, or national identity. It was a construct that was invented by Yasser Arafat in the 1970s, who himself is an Egyptian, in order to engage in these lawfare attacks, right? The use of the legal system, because they know they cannot defeat Israel on the battlefield, no matter how much terrorism and how much, asymmetric warfare they use. They will not be able to defeat Israel or the United States, for that matter, on the battlefield. So they need to construct a legal premise by which they are entitled not only to occupy land, like, for example, let's talk about the so-called West Bank, because we're always using this terminology. West Bank of what? Right? This is Judea, Samaria. If Jews are not from Judea, I do not know where we are from. And the whole settlers, right? Jews are settlers and settlements. There are Jewish homes, there are Jewish people, there are Jewish schools, and Jews have every right to live in that area. Now, if I were to tell you there's an area of Belgium, right, or square in Paris where no Jews are allowed to live, you'd say that's racist. But why are we arguing and saying it is required by international law to create these, Jude and Rhine zones in the Middle East, the only place where we can live freely under our own sovereignty and self-government, which we have every legal right to do. So it's just the use of the lawfare attacks and the manipulation of terminology and the perversion of the real meanings, which has really got us to this point in the first place, which is why speaking clarity and truth is just so shocking to everybody.
Well, this is, I think, the reason why this is so groundbreaking. President Trump's plan here, whether it eventually ends up becoming reality or whether he has just kind of spoken it, has exploded all of these premises and completely shifted, again, the grounds upon which all Middle Eastern policy for the West has been based for decades, which is exactly what he did with the Abraham Accords, and now he's doing it again. He did it when he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He basically gave the lie to the idea that the Arab Street was going to explode if the embassy was moved to Jerusalem. He exploded the lie that the Palestinian issue lay at the heart of all Israeli-Arab relations. He blew that up with the Abraham Accords, and now he's exploding the lie that the two-state solution was ever a required element of a future. And in fact, he's saying precisely the opposite, that it is in fact that idea that is the obstacle to peace in the Middle East. And I think that's going to change things pretty dramatically. The claims of people that this is somehow inhumanitarian, that's terrible. What's amazing to me is that their proposed alternative is for people to live in rubble for the next 10 to 15 years without any source of income. No one is going to be allowed by Israel to use a work visa, for God's sake, to go into Israel to get a job. There will be no functional economy, no infrastructure, no water, no power, nothing in that area. The area has been completely wrecked, specifically because, not because Israel is being brutal, but because Hamas literally implanted itself in these areas to force Israel to destroy them. And now they're all destroyed. What is the alternative plan? Yeah. Nobody has proposed an alternative plan that actually helps Palestinians other than both Israel and the United States.
Yeah, up until now, the world has been screaming, let them out. They're in an open-air prison. Get them out of Gaza. They should go move into Israel. Now, all of a sudden, when they're literally being used as human shields, when we're seeing the mass death of civilians that is being caused by Hamas, who's putting them in harm's way, all of a sudden the world wants them to stay and they won't let them out? I mean, what is this? This ridiculous, it's to me, it's so perverted, because anyone who is saying that Gazan civilians should not be allowed to leave Gaza is arguing that they should be murdered by Hamas. This is so clear to me. And thousands have already left voluntarily, which they have, every legal right to do. The entirety of the Israeli-Palestinian, I call it the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because there is no conflict between Israelis and a fictional Palestinian people. There is a regional war where Iran uses its proxies in order to dominate, spread chaos, and destabilize the Middle East. They want to spread the caliphate as a theologically motivated war. It's not about land per se. The Palestinian movement has nothing to do with creating a civil society, a so-called democratic Palestinian state. There has never existed a democracy in the Arab world ever. So the fact that we think that all of a sudden there's going to be a democratic Palestinian state and this is the solution is just so absurd. And yet anyone like me or you who has been speaking these, I guess, inconvenient truth for so long, and especially calling out radical Islam and the hate education that's happening in the Middle East, which is the root cause of the conflict. Because if you want to know what the future looks like in 10, 12 years, look at what they're teaching the 5, 6, 7-year-olds in their schools, and they're teaching them death and they're teaching them jihad. And anyone like me and you who have been calling this out as the true human rights violations have been slandered, have been called anti-Muslim, racist, Islamophobic, et cetera, we've been marginalized. And yet now, thank God, I guess I hate the term silver lining when it applies to what happened on October the 7th. But I guess the outcome of this that is slightly positive is that we have woken up, right? We've woken up not for the first time, but for the second time, because we were supposed to wake up after 9/11. But we had that whole Islamophobia mania campaign that made us shut up and not want to talk about issues of national security and theologically motivated radicalism. But now we've woken up again. And we're not willing, at least no matter how much the media and the so-called policy experts want to shove this, their ideas down our throats, we're like, this doesn't make any sense anymore. This is not working. And now with President Trump in office for his second term, it's provably false. It's not just theory, it's provably false.
Well, that's Brooke Goldstein. You can check out her work over at the Lawfare Project. Brooke, really appreciate the time and the insight.
This was an excellent interview, very, very clarifying. And as President Trump said, we are starting the era of common sense. Everything that Brooke Goldstein shared here is basic common sense, actually standing up for the rights of the Palestinians who are living under the oppression of Hamas. This is actually a gift that's being offered to hundreds of thousands of lives of people who are living under oppression, who will become indoctrinated into terrorism, as will their kids from infancy, unless we get them out of there and put them into a normal civilization.